Hi, Dr. BL. This is Mel. So I decided to do this presentation as a recording of my voice for two reasons. One, I think the concept of a more stream of consciousness and a a presentation where it's not just a written paper, but you're actually hearing my thoughts out loud and how I'm thinking is really helpful. And I also decided to do it like this because it's something that makes me pretty uncomfortable. I don't like to record my voice. I don't really like how it sounds when it's on feedback. So I'm trying to push myself and do something new, be creative, and this is what I came up with. So here is my key points presentation. So I started by choosing 6 key takeaways from the class. The reason I did this was actually because of something that I realized in this class. When I was in 2nd grade, I was assigned the number 6. It's become my favorite number. It's literally part of everything in my life. I've tried to incorporate it into every email or username or password. Now you can hack me, but I've always loved the number 6 because in 2nd grade, my teacher, Mrs. Martin, assigned us a number. And now the entire year, everything we did was based on that number. I was always number 6. I realized this was really problematic when I was taking this course because I think of how we talked about in the beginning of class, like calling an ELL by their name and by their real name, not their Americanized name, or by correcting it or shortening it to a way that's easier for us to say, is something that we talked about that was really offensive. So I kind of learned from this that even taking away my name and calling me a number was really offensive. So I chose to do 6 key takeaways as kind of an ironic twist on how I really learned from this class, and just wanted to show that the way you set this class up was so wonderful because it made me so self-aware, self-reflective, and I felt like everything that we did was metacognitive and really just helpful for me to learn about myself and to relook at everything that had been done when I was in high school that I had held in such a high esteem. And while I never viewed my teachers as perfect, it was really hard for me to see some of these inherent flaws that we've started to learn about. And granted, not everybody is perfect, and there are a lot more issues than just that. I think I really learned a lot about the little things that actually mean so much, like the fact that I internalized the number 6 as part of my identity, when in reality, calling me the number 6 was taking away from that. So that was just my intro for why I chose 6, and we can go ahead and get started. So number 1, English is great, but so are other languages. So I think it's really important for me to be open and honest. And when I started this class, I thought that being an ESL teacher meant I was going to teach kids English. So part of the reason I chose this is because, chose to be an ESL add-on was because I'm really, really passionate about foreign language. But to me, that meant I was going to be able to speak with Spanish students, since I was fluent in Spanish, to help them learn English. And also because I had struggled to learn another foreign language. So I understood that feeling. But I wanted to do this in a way that it was only spoken in English. The English language is something that's always been really fascinating to me, and something that I've always really enjoyed learning about. As a lit major, I wrote a lot. And so it was something that I was like, oh, this just really makes sense because of all of those reasons. So I went into this course thinking that the way to be an ESL or an ELL teacher was by speaking only English. And I realized from this class that that is so wrong, and so just a product of what we've been taught as society, that we've been taught, which we talked a lot about. And we also read a lot about that in the Rice book. Still not sure how to pronounce that. But we talk a lot about how, as American students, we are taught that English is not a way, it is the way. So we've been taught for so long that the only way to help students fit in is to assimilate and to speak English and no other language. And I think this really drove home with an example that one of our friends shared in class where she was mentioning that on an interview. I think it was Abigail who was like, it's so important for her to have two languages on an interview. But if you're Hispanic and you have two languages, that's seen as a disadvantage just because of your race. So that right there really stuck out to me for this as well, because two languages is something that is so important. And for some reason, I had always viewed it as an ESL, not as a disadvantage, but just as something that wasn't really important. I had seen it as important for students like me, who I spoke two languages, but I never saw it as important for other students who didn't. So I think that I learned a lot about that in particular. I realized that the way to teach ESL students is to use their native language. So if those are for Spanish students, I do speak their language and I'm able to help them in that language. But if it's for if it's for students that don't speak Spanish and their L1 is not Spanish, there are so many other ways to incorporate their language by doing translating before, which we talked about in class, and as part of co-teaching, and having instructions written out and having words predefined for them in their native language. So I learned a lot of, not only about how important it is, but how to incorporate it. And I think I really got to use this in my science lesson segment. I was making a worksheet for my students as a bridging, or no, it wasn't on the WIDA stand. It was a level 1. I was making a matching exercise, and I was writing instructions in English. And I swear I was sitting there, and I just it hit me. I was like, why am I only putting this in English when this is going to most of my Spanish speakers? So I wrote them in English and in Spanish. And I realized that that's something that's literally just so easy for me to do, is even if I didn't speak Spanish, by putting it into Google Translate, or there's so many other resources that we've shared with each other as a class that I can use and incorporate into my classroom. So I learned a lot about that. And I think I put this as number 1 because I think this is the number 1 thing I learned that I could take away was I really have changed my entire method for being a Spanish, or for not a Spanish teacher. I do want to teach Spanish as well, which is why I said that. For being an ESL teacher, I'm not just going to use English. I'm going to use their native language. And I think part of what's really driven that home is the point of teaching isn't English, to teach students English. It's to teach them the content. So, and I'll get more into that with my later points, but I think that's what really stuck out with me with this course. So takeaway 2, incorporating culture into classroom is indispensable. So I originally had listed this later on, but I realized how well this tied in with my first point. Incorporating culture into classroom is so important and so necessary. Just like using their native language is important and necessary, using their culture is too. And I realized this because there are a lot of examples that, when we talked about this in class, in word problems and in written examples and verbal examples, where we use words and idioms that ELLs don't understand, that make that translation just even harder. So to me, that was one thing that really stood out and really started to drive this home for me was this concept of word problems, because those are something to me that I remember reading as a kid and just kind of laughing at. But then I realized, after watching a few videos and doing some research on my own, that the word, an example would be like a city block, how we just call that a block. And when we say John had to walk 12 blocks. And for ELLs, that's really confusing because that's one of those words that has 2 meanings. And so being cautious of that's not something that every culture says is so important. And using words in context that are part of every culture is something that really makes a word problem great. It doesn't just need to be Stacy had 12 burgers. Maybe Stacy had 12 tamales, or anything, something to incorporate all students' culture into the classroom. And even further from that, other than just being word problems, we talk a lot about how students really want to learn when they're part of the learning. So incorporating everybody's culture as a content teacher is something that's really important, not just in an ELL classroom, but incorporating all students' cultures. So if you know that students are super passionate about something or have a lot of information about something or are from a certain country, just making that a part of your classroom and a part of your studying is what gets those students involved and make them feel like you're talking to them. It makes them feel like you've taken a lot of extra time and a lot of extra thought to incorporate them and involve them in your classroom. So I think that it's really important to do this because students need to feel as though their culture matters and that it's not that they have to assimilate into American culture, but rather it's something that we want to incorporate into our everyday lives. I remember being taught as a kid the concept of America being the mixing pot where all these different cultures interacted. But the reality is, it's a mixing pot, but then when we put it in the oven and bake the cake, we want everybody to come out as this white vanilla cake. And that's just not possible. When you put 30 different type of ingredients into a bowl, it's not going to come out tasting one way. Putting 30 different ingredients to the bowl is putting and trying to make it come out one way is impossible. And so I think it's important to show these students that their culture is important and it is valued. And I remember reading an article where it talked about the different funds of knowledge, which we talked about a lot. And learning those funds of knowledge is what has really helped me connect with my students. Those first few activities that we did were ones that I was able to count off of and remember as I was teaching. So when I recognized why one student may be struggling, or when I was recognizing why another student may need a little, may have like an example of what we were doing and using those as part of the classroom. And when we would talk about animals and habitats, we would talk about animals from their countries that we knew that they may know of when they lived there, and trying to make it something that they could relate to. So for time's sake, I'm going to move on to my third point. Modeling everything is necessary. So this is something that I just literally didn't know. I always knew that you needed to write things down and to be explicit so students could refer back to it, but I didn't realize just how intentional my modeling needed to be. I now know that my modeling literally needs to be everything I'm doing. If I'm making an arts and craft project, I need to have an example done. If I'm asking students to have a conversation, I need to model what their conversation should be about. And granted, this may not be for all students at every level that you need as much modeling, but modeling is something that's important for every student. So it's something that I also really learned has to be planned. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But modeling is something that you can't just come up with on a whim. You have to plan that out and you have to take the time to do it. And this is because you don't want to leave any student behind. You want to be mindful of where all your students are at and what all their needs are. So I learned a lot about having these models as something that made every student feel like they could answer the question and that they were smart enough to do this, because they are. It's just with this added language barrier, sometimes it's hard to explain what we're doing. And I really learned that the first week where we were trying to do activities and I could just see that they weren't understanding, that they were not understanding when we were just lecturing. And so the next couple days and over the last few weeks, I've been making very, very explicit. I've been making a very, very, I'm trying to think of the word, a very, very, like, I'm working really hard, I can't get that word, to make sure that I'm doing this modeling and making sure that all students understand it, because I do have some students who don't need a ton of modeling, but some students do. And so I want to make sure that I'm doing enough that every student understands it without feeling like they can't ask a question, because it is hard to ask questions and it's hard to feel like you're the only one who doesn't understand. So one of the ways we did this that I really learned from was when we played a game. Half the students understood what we were doing and half of them didn't. And that's because we gave them the instructions and assumed that they had played Four Corners, but a lot of them hadn't played Four Corners. And if they had, it was a modified version. So as the three co-teachers, we should have modeled this, and that was something I incorporated as we played future games, and as I asked students to raise their hands, and as we asked students to have conversations. It's more than just adding those like the WIDA standards where you're adjusting how students analyze or how students create or any of that. It's more than that. It's showing them how to do it and making it explicitly clear as to what is happening and what's going on. So that my next point is all students are smart. Speaking another language is not a deficit. So I think this was something that we talked about a lot about, the idea that all students have the intelligence to do something, and all students are there to I just want to pause really quick. I want to go back to the modeling because this just came into my head. I want to say that the Reese textbook or the Rice textbook, I think, was really great at showing us how modeling is so important. And Laura gave a lot of lessons, especially her immersion lesson, where it just further emphasized to me how many different types of modeling there are and how great that can be for students. So this is stream of consciousness, so I hope that doesn't take points off for that. But I want to go back to number 4, where all students are smart, speaking another language is not a deficit. So I think what really, really helped this make sense for me was that a lot of times we cast ELLs as EC students with disabilities, and that is just not always true. And we've looked at statistics in more than just this class, but learning that it's so easy to just cast this off to students, like cast students off as EC because we don't want to take the time to help them understand in their language. It really hurt. It really hurt me. And again, in Laura's immersion lesson, I really understood this because, and I shared this with the class, but it still has been on my mind when she spoke in Chinese and I didn't understand the math lesson. It hurt me because I do speak English, and I'm used to being able to raise my hand and participate when I'm in a classroom. And so it was really difficult for me to not be able to do that. That's part of how I define myself. I flourish in an academic setting more so than in any other setting. In fact, if you saw me in a social setting, you would be like, what in the world? But I was not able to raise my hand and answer a question because I didn't understand the language. And I just cannot imagine us seeing these students as anything as less than they are, because these students aren't not intelligent. They're so smart. They're just struggling to translate it into that other language. And Sam was talking about how it's like, if there's 4 steps for ELLs. They have to hear it, translate it, come up with an answer, translate their answer, and speak their answer, right? So it's just so many more steps than we have to go through when you're hearing something in your first native language that you speak really well. And so I learned a lot about how I can help students feel as though they're intelligent, assess them in other ways, and help them understand the content so that way they don't feel unintelligent, and they're also able to participate and show their intelligence, and it's not just left behind. And Abigail talked a lot about this when we were in a group, and she talked about how it's more than just a school deficit that hits. It's an emotional trauma that these students get when we don't hear them and we don't let them speak their truth and we make them feel as though they're stupid. And I think that we have to be so cautious as teachers to not only make sure that we are giving all students equal chances by modeling and by using WIDA standards and by incorporating their language and helping them understand it, but also by assessing them differently, because not every student, ELL or not, assesses in the same way. And also, sometimes assessments just aren't geared towards ELLs. So the true practice of intelligence isn't if you're speaking English, it's if you know the content. And if these students are able to understand the content and show that they're doing this just in a different way, we need to make sure that we're allowing that to happen. If that means that they're drawing something, or if that means that they need a word bank, because at the end of the day, all that matters is that they're getting this content. And English is important, but again, we talk a lot about finding that balance. And I know you say it's a coffee talk, and it really is, because I just would love to know more about it. But I can just not imagine taking this away from these students. It's so important to let them feel like they're intelligent and let them know that they are, because they are, and it's unfair of us as teachers to take that away from them. Our goal should be to help them express their knowledge as best as they can, because they have it. They just need a few extra steps in expressing it. And I am going to be so cautious to do this in my classroom. Rice gives a lot of ways when she was writing her book about how we can specifically do this for ELLs. And so I really want to make sure that I use these methods that Rice talked about and that we learned in class to help students show. And Laura's presentation, again, just this really stuck out with me about the models that she used when she was doing the second half, that I could feel like I could raise my hand and I could give the answer, because I didn't necessarily have to talk. I didn't have to have the right language. And so part of this is also allowing students to make mistakes. And Rice talks a lot about that, creating an environment where students feel comfortable to say, okay, I think I have the answer. I may not have the answer, but feeling okay and comfortable to make a mistake and looking for the content and not how they word the answer. So for time's sake, I will move on to number 5. Every student is different, and that is okay. So this is something that I really learned with the WIDA standards. It's daunting, the task of becoming a teacher to ESL students, because every student is at a different place and has different progress. And for me, that was something that was not only daunting, but frightening and discouraging, because I was worried about my capabilities of being able to best help those students. But with this class, I've learned so many methods about how to help my students. And this was something I really learned in the WIDA standards, and I really can't stress enough how important I think those are for us to have to create by ourselves, because A, it isn't easy. It's not easy to understand. But B, it really was something that was valuable when we had to redo them after the first time we did our math strands, because we were making it easier for every student and not assessing them on the same task. But that's not what the goal is. The goal is to have every student analyze something or use some sort of cognitive function, just using it in a different way. And that was something I realized, that it's not dumbing it down. It's just making it at their level. And I realized it's not hard to do that. And it's not something where it's like I'm creating 15 different assignments. It's that I'm adding things to certain lesson plans, and I'm modifying things, and I'm making it easier on my students. So I think that was something that really just drove home for me, because I feel like and it just it really shakes me up to even think this, but I looked at my students with a deficit, and I am just ashamed to even say that, but I learned that it's okay. I really learned that it was okay to have students that are different and have students that are at different levels, and to modify assignments. And I learned how to do that. And I think that's what was so important for me, was that list of words that you gave us, and the things that we talked about in class, and the readings that we did for the WIDA standards. I just learned so much that there are so many easy things to do that don't take a lot of time, and they aren't extra grading, as the Rice book talks about. It's just taking the time to think of all my students, and I always have time to do that. So I learned a lot from these WIDA standards, and I can't imagine not having learned them. And the Rice book gave a lot of really great examples of how you can take what you're making and literally just add sentence starters or add graphic organizers, and doing all of these things that you don't really think about as being structures. And I realized it's not that I'm creating 5 different lesson plans. And I know I'm getting a little repetitive, but this was one that really hit home for me, that it's okay to be different. And I think part of my reason I think this is because I was always in AP and honors courses, and it was never okay to not understand something. And there was only one way to do it, and that was that. And I think part of that is the fault of my teacher, because not every student learns in the same way, nor should we expect them to. But B, I should have been able to use all these different skills that I have and grow other skills and work on other skills. And I never had the opportunity to do that. So I felt like there was always one way, and that was the only way, and it was the right way. And if I couldn't do it, I was a failure. And this class helped me see that there are maybe 5 different ways to get the same thing. It's just what each student needs. And it makes me so excited to teach ELLs and to work with my own group of ELL students and to just help them get to where they need to go. Because at the end of the day, every student will have their own goals and be at their own level, and we have to work and gear our lessons towards them. So point number 6, actually, I still want to stay on this. Rice talks a lot about how it's really easy, and the co-teaching book really talks a lot about this too, is it's really easy to look at these students and think that they're less, and it's just not okay. And it's really easy to create, even in our heads as teachers, a hierarchy of students, even in an ELL classroom, where the students at the top are the best and vice versa. And it's just really easy to do that, and fighting that stereotype and fighting that desire is something that's really important for us as teachers to work on and to make sure that we're actively trying to not do, and working to make sure that we're working towards meeting those students' goals. And one of the things that I really liked in the Rice book was the concept of self-evaluation. Because at the end of the day, if your student is checking a 5 at the end of every day because they feel like they've improved, that's all that matters. And making those little differences. Not every student needs to be able to do the same things at the end of the class. They need to be able to all have the same content knowledge, and they all need to be able to analyze, but they may be able to do that in different ways. And that was something that really I really want to say, like, stuck out with me. So 6, teaching ELL students takes time. So I think this is a really good last point to end on, because teaching ELLs is something that shouldn't be easy. It shouldn't be something that we just chalk up to, oh, it's just this really quick modification, or, like, I can just wing this. It's something that takes time and planning. So this really wraps up all 5 points well, because the concept of modeling, the concept of incorporating culture, the concept of integrating language, different languages, the concept of, modifying and understanding that every student is different, is something that as a teacher takes a lot of time for us to work into our lessons. We have to be cautious, and we have to understand how our students are, and that takes time and planning. And co-teaching is something that I really think drove this home. The book by Dove and Henningsfield, I learned a lot from this book. Co-teaching is something that I cannot wait, and I hope that I have the opportunity to use in a classroom, because it really helps all students, not just ELLs, but especially ELLs. And it takes a lot of time to co-teach. In the book, Devin Hinsfield talked a lot about that in the book, about how co-teaching and teaching ELLs is something that does require a few extra hours of planning every week. And it requires time to meet with your co-teacher, and it requires time to add modifications, and it requires time if it's a pull-out classroom where students have to leave, and it requires time if it's a push-in classroom where you have to turn over some of your lessons sometimes. And it's something that requires pre-planning, and it's not easy. Modeling was something that I thought I could do on a whim. It's not. I had to write out the dialogue in those science learning segment plans. I had to create examples to show students, and I had to understand that they needed that, and that was something that was not only worth the time, but had to be part of my time. So I think, like, what I really learned about time is that I've always been a good time manager. I'm really, honest, not to toot my own horn, but I would say that's one of my biggest strengths is time management. And I learned that a lot of my time management when I'm lesson planning needs to be given to those ELLs and to those EC students who need that extra planning, who need that extra time. And Rice talks about also, and I think this is equally as important as teaching ELL students takes time, ELL students sometimes need extra time for assignments. They need the extra time to work on papers, and you have to incorporate that and allow them to do what they need. And I think a lot of times it's really easy to view that as like oh, that's why they have a disability, or they're EC students, and it's really easy to chalk it up to that. But in reality, these students are doing, like I said earlier, 5 different types of cognitive function, and they're doing more than anyone else. So we have to let them have extra time to do those things that we're expecting and that they're required to do. So allowing them extra time to do assignments and to do is something that is not only a good thing for a teacher to do, but a necessary thing for a teacher to do. So overall, teaching ELL students is not something that's easy. It's not something that should be seen as easy. It's something that does certainly take time for teachers to incorporate into their classroom, and it shouldn't be chalked up to anything less. I think I just really want to drive home that teaching ELL students is something that may take extra time, but is so worth it, because watching those students have successes is something that I can already imagine being great. And hearing in our 783 class and also my 628 class in the afternoons, these are students that you connect with for life. When they connect with you, they never let it go, and you don't have to either. And I think that that's something that should be really an important point. And teaching ELL students it just sounds like a gift more than it does a burden, like a lot of people say. And that being said, I understand that it may be part of that time is having to work with administrators and having to work with other teachers in a sense to try to prove that these students aren't less and that they are equals. And it's something that's so worth it, because for those students, to have someone taking the time for them and to fight for them is something that they need. And to give them those modifications and to take the time to plan for them, that's what going the extra mile is. And to me, that's what being an ELL teacher is. And Rice offers a lot of really great methods for doing this. And I think co-teaching is something that was really one of my favorite methods. And I really liked co-teaching method number 1, where one teaches and one teaches with purpose, and how you can have a teacher who's showing examples, pulling up maps, defining vocabulary, and those sort of things are something that are so easy to incorporate into your lesson, but it just takes time to make sure that you're doing it. And I don't want to go on forever, so I really could talk about this point for a long time. I just learned so much about not only the methods of taking time to teach ELL students, but just how important and valuable it is in their lives and in mine. So thanks for listening. I know this was a bit of a stream of consciousness, and again, that's really what I wanted it to be. I wanted you to see my thinking and to hear my thinking out loud instead of it being something so formal. So I hope this makes sense, and I hope I did the assignment the way I was supposed to. I kind of just took this idea and ran with it, but thank you so much for teaching this class the way you did and for giving us the opportunity to work with these students, because it's something and an experience that I will never forget. It has started out my year for my MAT program in such a happy way, and I love that I got to do this and learn so much from you. I hope that I get to have you again as a teacher. I know you got the job with UNC, yay. And I'm really hoping I get to have you again, because I just love the way you teach and the passion that you have that's so obviously there. So thank you. And I don't know if I'll see you after you watch this, but if not, I hope to see you at the start of the school year.